Alright, so the one ring to rule them all is the most perfect object in fiction. It's both the plot and the themes. It is both a thing that you can put in your pocket and a metaphysical proposition. Now, I'm not a Tolkien expert, forgive me if I slander details. I know he was a meticulous bloke, putting an amazing amount of intricacy and inner logic at every level of his world. Today, I'll be prying into the minds of philosophers and psychoanalysts to simulate how they feel about the One Ring, and also, maybe more entertainingly, what they do with the fucking ring. Nietzsche. So this is a spicy one, especially since Tolkien was a devout Catholic. So Nietzsche would be a scathing critic of the moral integrity of the Fellowship, with the exception of Frodo, who genuinely endured the ring's darkness. So Nietzsche is concerned with the origin and sociological development of moralities, and not whether they're true, but what the agenda that the morality was born under was. Obviously, the ring was created like a new doctrine might have been. So the fact that the Fellowship needed to avoid the dark side of themselves via the ring to maintain virtue means every level of who they are have not realized virtue. Not only that, but identification with being pure and weak creates resentment that causes a lot of infighting within the Fellowship. So now Nietzsche would likely deny the absolute evil of the ring and tell you to think about it from relativism. But since Nietzsche is a provocateur, he'd hoard the ring for himself, flaunting it around, making a mockery of good and evil, since it is a construct that needs to be destroyed in a volcano, which represents that a single rigid evil can only be antagonized with the rigid good that it was contextualized with. Nietzsche would first overcome the darkness of the ring and be master of both the disinhibited and the inhibited worlds, as Übermensch. But then, having illegitimized the evil construct it was forged with, he's free to weld the ring into anything he wants. Sigmund Freud. So you'll notice this trend of the ring's temptation taking place in the bearer's unconscious, and Freud pioneered that idea. Of course, the ring is an agent of the unconscious taking control of the superego, which is our image of ourselves that the ego is trying to reconcile with the id, where the unconscious desire is. But fundamentally for Freud, the unconscious is an innate structure, yes. But what stuff winds up in that structure has to come from the world itself. And Sauron himself cannot put stuff directly into your unconscious without a middleman. So the fact that the ring bearers have visions specifically of Sauron is a symbolism for a more personal source. Really, whatever complexes someone has that the ring brings out, i.e. Boromir's masculine inadequacy, Bilbo's paranoid antisocial tendencies, can really only hold the superego of the bearer accountable for beating the unconscious in a way that makes it act in unhealthy ways. Now, Freud's idea of the unconscious was that if the urges in the unconscious weren't twisted unnaturally by our superego and by extension society, the ring's disinhibitedness would not cause the bearer to act out maliciously. So really, Freud most definitely would be keeping the ring for himself. Which, because Freud himself had a lot of complexes, would probably make him a degenerate. He would be Gunnar Gollum. His chief aim would be trying to reform society to be more accepting of the unconscious, so the ring can give positive insights into your needs. An attempt to destroy the ring would only set a precedent to develop more complexes to suppress whatever the ring tapped into. Carl Gustav Jung. So I think Jung is probably the most in alignment with Tolkien's philosophy to fiction than anyone else here. Now, the world of Middle-earth was imagined before The Hobbit even, as Tolkien's nitpicking at languages in fantasy, why they're unrealistic, and why it's bad for fantasy. So the actual theoretical inner logic of Middle-earth was established before anything else, which is strange coming from a man that likes his fairy tales to not have allegory or meaning. The story should just be understood on its own imaginary terms for Tolkien. So that begs the question for Jung, if the plot of destroying the ring doesn't map onto reality, and is only for aesthetics, how can their journey to Mordor be one that's actually a journey into ourselves? Otherwise, the ring's temptations would not feel like it's tempting real internal structures in the psyche. And for Jung, these structures are archetypes. Archetypes are kind of like personified facets of ourself that have a pattern of showing up in fiction and spiritual ideas. These facets of self don't care if they've never been brought on by lived experience or embraced as a self-proclaimed identity. More or less, they are artifacts always in our psyche that we can neglect or learn from, and they are often unconsciously given an agency when creating stories or dreaming. They don't act the same depending on how integrated they've been into yourself. So if Bilbo is retreating from adventure and Gandalf is advancing adventure in an uncharacteristic aggression, these are two archetypes within Tolkien trying to level each other out through the integration of Gandalf's archetype, which is something like the Shadow initially, but only to provoke further development. The whole plot of Lord of the Rings is different archetypal attitudes trying to master the shadow archetype, with a caution around its necessary but dangerous integration. The shadow, by the way, is sort of the dark part of human nature that specifically we don't want to know, and in that abandonment it gets its malice. So, in some sense, the main conflict of Lord of the Rings is why we shouldn't just stash it away somewhere and not have to address it. Well, we know why, because the shadow will send people to hunt you for it. The back and forth pull between ring bearers is a form of letting all facets of yourself allocate the burden of what would, if it were a tyrant, consume you whole. And there are many with one particular overdeveloped archetype. Gollum, for example. So you damn well know Jung is taking the ring to Mordor, acutely aware of what the ring contained, and why abandonment won't get rid of his association to its darkness. Arthur Schopenhauer. So most of the difference in these thinkers will come from how they interpret the ring's temptation. Arthur Schopenhauer, for example, would say the ring can be reduced into a basic, all-consuming drive that all consciousness is made of. So this universal will has no agenda besides satisfying itself. For Schopenhauer, it doesn't matter what Sauron wants, whatever the shape that takes, because the driving force that morality or personality is subservient to is the same as Frodo's, Gandalf's, Boromir's, Saruman's. So really, the moral source of the ring and the imperative to destroy it is just a pointless endeavor. The ring lowers your inhibition like alcohol might, and turn you into raw will, which is a desire that fundamentally cannot be fulfilled, and the process of trying to is the source of suffering. The fact that the Fellowship focuses so much on the ring as an in and of itself thing, and places to go as a consolation to problems material and not, is a misguided way of looking at the world. The physical world journey and plot devices won't encompass all of Schopenhauer's philosophy. The consciousness will is a separate thing from the physical world, and it's only through our subjective, all-consuming drive and perception that the world can exist to us. So in a way, thinking about the ring as one idea and encoding it with being is actually a facade for the fact the source of the ring's effect happens in a structure in the mind originally. So walking to Mordor would be an overemphasis on the world as representation, and not will. So ultimately, Schopenhauer would see keeping or giving away or destroying the ring as not addressing the source of suffering. I mean, man, if he was given it, he would probably leave it around his house, and some random guy would loot it from, his negligence. Hegel. Oh, another German guy. Great. I'm sorry that I'm mostly versed in German idealism, alright? So for Hegel, the plot of Lord of the Rings is actually a small cog in a larger story of truth. There's something driving the development of moral systems in a truthful direction over the course of history. This is probably where my Tolkien knowledge falters because I don't have a PhD in the anthropology of Middle-earth. But what I can tell you is that the battle against evil using good that the Fellowship wages is a part of an ongoing story. So basically, Hegel says any conflict in a time between two contrary philosophies is a dialectic, and dialectics resolve into the subject that will be the basis for another dialectic. Bringing up old shit. But the only explanation that allows each new dialectical resolution to produce some greater truth is if the motivations on each side of the dialectic have built into them the potential for ultimate philosophical truth. He calls this motivation the human spirit. It's similar to Schopenhauer's will if it wasn't just arbitrary and actually had a conceptual drive. The ring is largely how this current dialectic is accelerated, as it divides harder depending on whose hand it is for what purpose. And the experience of having this ring strengthens your conviction of its nature, so really thinking about the ring as an idea that needs to be eradicated is counterintuitive because both sides of the dialectic play an equal part in humbling the other. And the ring more or less represents the conflict and synthesis itself. So to answer the question, if Hegel had the ring, he'd probably intentionally pass it through as many hands as possible to accelerate dialectical progression. But then again, it wouldn't be Hegel, per se, passing hands, but the human spirit itself. we see that the ring has an agency of its own. It's personified as having betrayed or shifting places to fall into new hands or bringing attention to itself like a narcissist. Now, I know what you're thinking. If the ring is an agent of truth, why doesn't it just give visions of the ultimate truth instead of passive aggressively manipulating truth? Well, like I said, the human spirit has truth in its DNA, but like an adolescent needs a coming of age to reveal its nature to itself. And that involves a lot of destruction and provocative poison. Thank you so much for watching. I had a lot more philosophers planned. I was going to do Marx, I was going to do Lacan. I was going to do a few other guys, but I couldn't make it work. Marx in particular was just cheesy and just terrible, so I didn't do that. But if you enjoyed, please subscribe, like if you'd like. Uh, Feel free to interact with me in the comments. If you are publicly subscribed to me, I will subscribe to you as well. And thanks for watching.